I made a Go board that has storage for the game pieces. Recently, my son discovered this game Go, and he loved playing it online, so I decided to make him a real-life version for his birthday. I've never heard of this game before, so if you haven't either, it is an ancient Chinese game, and it's believed to be the oldest game that was ever created. So I was looking at some of these boards online. There are some that are really inexpensive, but there were some that were hundreds, even thousands of dollars. So if you make stuff for craft fairs and things like that, this could be a really cool thing to make. This was all just me experimenting. I experimented with the draws. I experimented with the way I routed out the lines, experimented with the epoxy. I had a lot of fun. Some mistakes were made, but in the end, I think that it looks pretty cool, and I hope my son's happy with it. So let's get into it. I decided to use red oak for this project because that's what I had on hand. When I first envisioned making this, I wanted to make it out of one big solid chunk of wood, but I didn't have any of that. So I cut up this red oak to size, and then I glued it together. I made two of these panels. One's going to be for the top and one's going to be for the bottom. Once the glue dried, I scraped away at the excess with a paint scraper, and then I started marking out all the lines for the board. I made a center mark and then moved out towards the edges of the boards and made a mark at every 7/8 of an inch until I had 19 lines. Then I turned the board around, and then I found the center again and repeated the same process. This is a full-size 19 by 19 board. There are also smaller boards, 13 by 13 and 9 by 9. So then I went and I brought all those lines up from the edge and I created this grid pattern. Traditionally, the lines on a Go board or Goban are painted, but I decided to use a V-groove bit in my router to create some added dimension, and I'm going to paint in the grooves. I used a fence for my router, which made it so simple. This fence references the center of my router bit, so all I had to do is line it up with my cut, clamp it down, lift up the flap, and then just route away. You could see how the V-groove bit is perfectly on that line, and it really was satisfying to do. After a little while, all of the lines were done, and I cut it to size on my crosscut sled at the table saw. Next, I turned my attention to the blocks that are going to make up the center of the board. These blocks are going to be sandwiched in between the top and bottom of the board, creating support, and they will also hold the draw slides that will hold the draws in place. After that glue dried, I flushed it up at the crosscut sled, and also off camera I glued up some blocks that were 4 of those pieces wide, and that's going to be the draw fronts. I wanted the draw fronts to be end grained just like those blocks, so it kind of flowed together well. That was a 1/4 inch thick that I cut off there. So now I have the top and bottom panels. I cut some side pieces there. I have the support blocks and I have the draw fronts. Now I need a piece that's going to go in the back of the support blocks to stop the draw in place. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, so I used my kerf maker to get the perfect measurement and cut a dado in the support blocks that's going to hold that plywood. So I made the first cut with my kerf maker, and then I almost made a really big mistake here. I just flipped it over and I totally forgot that I swapped out my blade. So I was about to make a cut and then remembered. So it was a quick fix. I quickly adjusted my kerf maker, and then I was able to make the second cut, and it was the perfect width for that 1/4 inch piece of plywood. Now that the kerf maker was set, I was able to quickly make the rest of the dados on the rest of the support blocks. And instead of measuring, I used the support block itself as a guide to how wide to cut the piece of plywood that was going to fit in those dados. I lined up the draw fronts in between the 2 support blocks and then measured from one end of the dado to the other end of the dado, then cut that on the miter saw. Now I have the 2 pieces of plywood that fit perfectly into those dados, and now next I need to make some grooves for the draw slides. I didn't want the groove showing through the front of these blocks, so I did a plunge cut using marks on my fence as a guide for where to start and stop. To make the draw slides, I used that router bit that I just used, and I used it to make a perfect measurement for the pieces that are going to fit perfectly into that slot. The end of that slot was round from the router bit, so I just used my chisel to clean up the corners to square it all up. Once square, I lined up the piece that I had cut earlier for the draw slides, made a mark for where to cut it, and then cut it to length on the miter saw. Moving on to the draws, I decided to make them out of 1/2 inch plywood, so I ripped them to height at the table saw and then cut them to length at the miter saw. To join all these pieces, I'm going to be using finger joints or box joints, and I made a whole other video on how to make this jig, The only thing that you need to know is that you always need to reference the same side of your workpiece when making these cuts. So I made a mark on the tops of all my pieces and always made sure that that mark was against the pin or the key there. And I just cut along and made all the slots. I cut the joints in the 2 longer pieces first, and then when making the mating pieces, I made sure to flip over that first piece so it was referencing the first cut that I made, and then continued to make the rest of the cuts, making sure that that reference mark, the top mark of my pieces, was always against the pin. I love how simple this joint is to do, and it just looks so cool and has such a cool impact. Moving on, I glued the draw slides into the grooves that I cut at the router table earlier, and then I started to glue up the draws. Gluing up these finger joints is a little bit tricky because they're so small, but just put glue everywhere, spread it all around with one of those little brushes, and squeeze them into place. When you clamp it, you just have to make sure that everything is just really square and that you're putting pressure not on the joint itself because it's protruding a little bit. You want it to be a little bit off of the joint. So as I mentioned, it was protruding a little bit because I set the blade a little bit high. That was very easy to just clean up at the sander, and it looks great. In order for them to slide on those draw slides I made earlier, I made a groove down the center at the router table. And for the draw bottom, I'm using this 1/8 inch piece of plywood, so I set up a rabbiting bit to that height, and then I ran the draw around the rabbiting bit, making sure to go the opposite direction than you normally would at the router table because it was the inside of an object. I measured from one end of the rabbit to the other end of the rabbit to get the perfect width for the draw bottom, and then I ripped it to size. Then I just placed that piece into the rabbit and marked out where to make the rest of the cuts, and then cut it on the miter saw. The corners of the rabbit were round, so instead of squaring them up, I just decided it was quicker and easier to round that piece of plywood, and it fit perfectly into place. I put glue all along the rabbit and then put the piece of plywood into place and then secured it all with my brad nailer. Alright, so now it's time to glue everything up. Since there are so many different parts to this, I decided to glue it up in stages so nothing would move around. I decided to go with the draw fronts first. I did a glue size on that end grain. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is later on in the video, and then clamped it up. Once that was dry, I decided to glue in the backer pieces into the 2 dados, making sure that they were in a position where the draws were sliding in and out freely. Once that glue set up, I cut some scraps that were slightly wider than the draws that I made so that when I glued those side blocks onto the support blocks, I could clamp it and it won't be so super tight that the draws wouldn't move. There would be a little bit of room. Now that the middle section was all one piece, I can sandwich everything together without worrying that any of the pieces of the middle section are going to shift or move around. I made sure to keep those scrap spacers for the draws in there to ensure that the draws were going to slide smoothly. I mentioned earlier this was a present for my son, and that's who's helping me with the glue there. I just had to take a moment to teach him a neater way how to spread the glue. After I taught him, he was good and we were good to go. He had no idea that he was helping me on his birthday present because the grid was facing down. So I just think that was pretty cool. After we were done spreading the glue all around, I sandwiched all the pieces together and used every clamp I had and set it off to dry. While that was drying, I started working on the pulls for the draws. I thought that I was going to be able to do some sort of like built-in pull, like a hole through it, but I didn't want the pieces to fall through, so it had to stop. I started with a small bit. It was too small, not comfortable, then used a larger bit, and that was better. So I decided to make that same hole on the bottom so you could pinch the pieces, but then my clamp slipped and it totally messed up the fronts. So I decided to cut off the front and just change gears and do a different kind of pull. I just drilled one hole and then I put a dowel through it. That way also when you're pulling on the dowel, you're pulling at the plywood because I drilled it deep enough that the glue is attached to the plywood to the dowel and you're not pulling on the end grain draw front. Everything was ready for sanding and I sanded all that end grain flush, but I wanted the draws to be flush as well, so I didn't glue in that little dowel handle yet, and I marked off where to sand the front, and then I took it to the benchtop sander, sanded up to those lines, and then it was fully flush. I could pull out the draw with the tape, and then afterwards I glued the dowel in. I chamfered all the edges with a block plane, and I sanded in all the grooves as well. There are 9 circles on the Go board called star points, so I just used a brad point bit in my drill to drill out those holes, and then I glued those dowels into place into the draws finally. Off camera, I cut up some blocks for the feet. Remember I mentioned glue size earlier? So when you're gluing end grain, the glue just soaks up into the grain of the wood and the bond is not strong. So what you want to do is called a glue size, when you put a layer of glue on first and it soaks up into the end grain. And then you wait about 10 minutes or so, and then you can add on another layer of glue, and that glue will not get soaked up into the grain and it will be stronger. Oak has a really open grain, and I'm going to be painting in those grooves, and I don't want the paint to seep into the grain. So I sealed it up with some shellac first before painting in the grooves. I made sure to get into all the grooves, but it wiped off the excess, and I did 3 coats of that before I started to paint. This was a little bit tedious. I think it took me about an hour to finish the whole thing, but it was actually really relaxing to do. And I didn't have to worry about painting on top of the wood at all, like getting outside of my lines, because I used that layer of shellac, and then when I sanded it off, it mostly sanded off and it was pretty good. I prepared the underside with packing tape before pouring on some tabletop epoxy. The packing tape is going to collect any drips. It is also self-leveling epoxy, so I made sure that everything was level before pouring it on. This is 2 parts that are a ratio for 1:1, so I poured in part A, and then I poured in part B, and then got to mixing. I actually poured way more than I needed. I needed like half of that, maybe a quarter of it. So I just poured it on and then spread it around with a spreader and used a brush on the sides to make sure that it was soaking into the end grain. I also used that packing tape around the opening of the draw, and I popped all the bubbles. And after it was dry, I peeled away at the packing tape, and all those drips came off so easily. And then I finished the underside, and it was done. So this was a fun project. It was really fun to experiment. I had some fails, some successes. I really wanted it to look like it was carved out of a solid block of wood. That's why I did the end grain draw fronts and the end grain blocks over here. Doesn't quite look like it's a solid block of wood, but the idea is there. And I would love to be able to try this out of a solid chunk of wood, or just maybe like bigger, like 4x4 pieces that were glued together or something. The way that I would do that is like the way you make a bandsaw box, I think. And I would love to see that. I think that would be really cool. So the way that I routed out the lines, I think, was great. I love that the epoxy filled in the grooves, so it has like this dimension to it. I think it looks killer. But the paint is not perfect in the grooves, and I think that's because of the oak. So using the shellac definitely really helped. I was able to sand away most of it, but there are some spots that are in the end grain where the paint did seep through. So it was not perfect. If I do this next time, I would not use oak. I would use something that has a more of a closed grain, like poplar or something like that. And yeah, other than that, I think it looks pretty cool. I think the biggest mistake that I made was that these draws are just not big enough to hold all of these pieces. I think I forgot the number that you need for the game, but it doesn't hold all of them. So on my website, I'll put the dimensions of what I think would be good, what I think the good size for these draws would be. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you on the next project. Surprise! Happy birthday.
I don't know. Thanks, Mom.
Do you know what it is?
Yeah, it's a Go board.
How do you play?
So, I'm putting pieces on the corners.
Yeah.
And keep on going.
You take turns?
Yes, you take turns.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do
then,
you have to like start somewhere? Like, what are these circles for?
I don't know. They're just there.
Okay.
So then you keep on going. Yeah. And when one of the other people's things get completely surrounded, and well, one color gets completely surrounded in another color, not including corners, their piece gets taken out. In the end, whoever has the most pieces on the board wins. And this, no, actually, this was on the black pieces. This is called an eye. When you have 2 eyes, then the piece you have there is, so first of all, when you have an eye, the other color has to go completely around it and in the middle to take out your pieces. So then when you have 2 eyes, it's impossible for that piece to get taken out. So when you get 2 eyes,
Yeah.
2 eyes, now it's impossible for this to get out. And I can put this here also. So now it would be a good idea for me to keep on stretching from this because it's impossible for it to go out. Because they would have to go all the way around this and inside both of these, which you can't do. That would make you go out.
Alright. Do you guys get that?
If you don't understand that, I'm sorry, I'm not the best explainer.
You did a pretty good job.
You don't know what I'm doing.
You don't know what I'm doing.
Oh, you like can't go there.
Yeah, you can't go inside. You cannot go inside of the hole.
Yep. Well, what are you having for dinner?
Mom,
What is
what
the
I'm
game
doing.
called?
It's called Go. Is that a funny name?
And do you know where the game is from?
Where?
Japan, right?
I thought it was Chinese, but you might be right.
And also, it's good that it's made out of wood. It's supposed to be made out of wood. I mean, you can make it out of whatever you want, but it's supposed to be made out of wood.